If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Daniel Morrison, but everyone calls me Dan. I've been a ranger at Yellowstone National Park for 8 years now, ever since I left the army. The job usually means helping lost hikers and making sure tourists don't feed the bears. But lately, things have been different. Strange. The kind of strange that makes my skin crawl and brings back memories I've tried hard to forget. It started 3 weeks ago, during the last full moon. I was doing my usual night patrol when I got a call about some dead animals near Old Faithful. Nothing too weird about that. We get predator kills all the time. But when I got there, I knew something was wrong. The deer hadn't just been killed. It had been torn apart in ways that didn't make sense. No wolf or bear I know would do that. And there were these weird marks carved into the trees nearby, like nothing I'd ever seen before, being part Blackfeet. I grew up hearing stories about supernatural creatures from my grandfather. He always said I had the sight, a special ability to sense things others couldn't. I used to think those were just bedtime stories, until 2 years ago when, well, that's a different story. A story that cost me my partner and drove me to drink more than I should. The next night, tourists at Canyon Village Campground reported seeing something that made my blood run cold. They described massive wolf-like creatures walking on 2 legs, taller than any man. The tourists were scared, but not as scared as they should have been. They hadn't seen what these creatures had done to that deer. Then came the moon. For 3 nights straight, it hung in the sky like a giant red eye, watching us. The color wasn't natural, more like fresh blood than the usual harvest moon. The wolves in the park started acting weird too. Normally, they stay in their own territories, but now they were gathering in large groups, moving together like they were following orders. I tried to tell my boss something was wrong, but he just blamed it on stress and too much bourbon. Maybe he was right about the bourbon part. I've been hitting it pretty hard since losing Tom, but I know what I saw. And last night, when I found another mutilated animal near an old native burial ground, I spotted something that made me drop my flashlight. There, in the mud, was a footprint, but not from any animal I knew. It started like a wolf's paw but stretched out, almost like a human hand, and next to it, scratched into a tree trunk, was a symbol I recognized from my grandfather's stories, a symbol that meant only one thing. The skinwalkers had come to Yellowstone, and they were hunting. I spent the next few days digging into what was happening. First stop was Billy Running Wolf, an elder who lived just outside the park. I'd known him since I was a kid, and he knew all the old stories. When I showed him pictures of the symbols and the footprints, his face went white. "These marks," he said, touching the photos with shaking fingers, "they're from the dog men, ancient spirits that can wear human skin like a coat. My grandfather saw them once, a whole pack of them. They're not just animals, Dan. They think, they plan, and they're getting stronger." He told me something else that made my stomach turn. According to the old stories, when a dogman bites you, you become one of them. The change happens slowly at first. You get stronger. Your senses sharpen. You start craving raw meat. Then, during the full moon, You transform completely. I didn't want to believe it. But things kept getting weirder. That afternoon, I found more tracks near Lake Yellowstone. They showed how the creatures moved, not like animals running wild, but like soldiers on patrol. They were working together, setting up ambush points, creating escape routes, just like we did in the army. The regular wolves were acting stranger too. I watched a pack of them through my binoculars, and what I saw wasn't natural. They moved in perfect formation, like they were being controlled. When their alpha lifted its head, all 12 wolves turned at exactly the same time, like puppets on strings. Then I found something that chilled me to the bone. Hidden in a cave near an old burial ground, there was an altar made of bones. Not just animal bones, human ones too. They were arranged in a pattern that matched the symbols on the trees. This wasn't just a pack of monsters hunting for food. They were performing rituals, following some kind of ancient plan. I tried calling for backup, but who would believe me? How do you tell your supervisor that mythical creatures are setting up shop in a national park? I knew I had to handle this myself. But as I sat in my cabin that night, loading silver bullets into my gun, another trick I learned from the stories, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in way over my head. The red moon would be full again in just a few days, and this time, the dog men would be ready. I never thought I'd see anything worse than what happened in Afghanistan. I was wrong. It started with screams from Pine Grove Campground. By the time I got there in my truck, the attack was already happening. The dogmen weren't hiding anymore. They were right there in the open, standing on 2 legs, some as tall as bears. Their fur was dark as night, and their eyes glowed like burning coals. I counted at least 6 of them. They moved like a team, cutting off escape routes, herding people like sheep. One of them caught my eye and smiled, actually smiled, showing teeth that looked too human to be on a wolf's face. They weren't just animals anymore. They could think, plan, and they wanted us to know it. The massacre happened so fast. 15 people gone in minutes. Some were torn apart. Others were bitten and dragged away. Those were the unlucky ones. I tried to help, fired my whole clip, but the bullets just made them angry. Only the silver round I kept for emergencies seemed to hurt them, and I only had one. The worst part was watching them change. One minute they'd be walking on all 4s like regular wolves. The next they'd stand up straight like men. Some even spoke, not in words, but in growls that somehow made sense in my head. They were talking to the regular wolves too, controlling them like an army. That's when I saw Steve Mitchell, my fellow ranger, stumbling out of the woods. He'd been missing for 3 days. His clothes were torn, and he had a bite mark on his arm. Before I could reach him, he started changing. I watched my friend's face stretch into a muzzle, his fingers turn into claws. The sound of his screams turning into howls will haunt me forever. I ran back to my cabin and called Billy. He told me what I'd already figured out. These weren't just random attacks. The dogmen were building a pack. Every person they bit and didn't kill would turn into one of them. They were transforming tourists, rangers, anyone they could catch. But the tourist camp was just the beginning. That night, sitting in my cabin with my gun loaded and doors barred, I heard them howling. It wasn't the normal howl of wolves. It was a song, A calling. They were summoning others of their kind. The red moon hung in the sky like a warning, and somewhere in the dark, I heard Steve howling back. The next few days were the hardest of my life. People I knew, people I worked with, they started disappearing one by one. Dr. Helen Carter was the first. She was a wildlife biologist who'd been studying the wolves for years. She thought she could understand what was happening to them. I found her research camp torn apart, her cameras smashed. The last video on her laptop showed her trying to document a wolf pack's behavior. Then the wolves stood up on two legs, and the video went black. Jim Blackwood was next. He was an old hunter who knew these woods better than anyone. He didn't believe my warnings. Said he'd been hunting wolves for 40 years and wasn't scared of any ghost stories. They found pieces of him spread across 3 miles of forest, arranged in those same strange patterns I'd seen before. The Anderson family hit me the hardest. Mum, Dad, and 2 kids who were just here to see Old Faithful. I'd given them directions to a camping spot just that morning. By midnight, the parents were gone, and the kids were changing, their small bodies twisting as the dogman's bite took hold. I still hear their cries in my nightmares. Billy Running Wolf knew what was coming. He said he'd seen it in a dream, the whole park being taken over, turned into hunting grounds for the dogmen. He gave me his grandfather's medicine bag, filled with sacred herbs and stones. These might help, he said, but they'll cost a price. That night, Billy went up to Sacred Ridge alone. He knew the dogmen would come for him. He used himself as bait, drawing them away from a group of campers who were trying to escape. The last thing I saw was Billy standing at the edge of the cliff, surrounded by glowing eyes, chanting an ancient prayer. Then the rocks crumbled, and he took half the pack down with him. I sat in my cabin that night, holding Billy's medicine bag, looking at pictures of everyone we'd lost. The dogmen were getting stronger, their pack growing with every person they turned. And somewhere out there was Steve, my friend, now one of them. The worst part, the lunar eclipse was coming. Billy had warned me about it, a time when the barriers between worlds would be weakest, when the dogmen would be at their strongest, and their leader, the oldest and most powerful skinwalker, would reveal itself. I loaded my last silver bullets and grabbed Billy's medicine bag. Tomorrow night would be the eclipse, and one way or another, this had to end. The eclipse started just after sunset. The moon turned blood red, then slowly went dark. That's when they came. I was waiting at the old burial grounds, Billy's medicine bag around my neck, my rifle loaded with the last 3 silver bullets. The herbs in the bag burned my skin, but they kept me hidden from the dogman's senses. They came in a pack of 20 or more, walking upright like men but moving like wolves. In the center was something bigger, much bigger. It had to be 9 feet tall, with fur as black as coal and eyes that glowed like fire. The Alpha, the original skinwalker. Then I saw Steve. My old partner was at the Alpha's side, his fur gray like his hair had been. When he turned his head, I saw recognition in his wolf eyes. He remembered me. The pack formed a circle and started chanting, not in words, but in deep growls that made the ground shake. The Alpha raised its massive arms to the darkening moon, and the symbols on the trees began to glow. I knew I had to act fast. Billy had told me that during the eclipse, the skinwalkers would try to open a doorway to bring more of their kind into our world. The only way to stop them was to kill the Alpha before the moon went completely dark. I took aim with my rifle, but Steve caught my scent. He howled a warning. The pack turned toward me, and everything happened at once. I fired my first silver bullet at the Alpha, but it moved too fast. The second shot hit Steve as he leaped at me. The look in his eyes as the silver burned him, part pain, part gratitude, told me he'd rather die as my friend than live as a monster. The pack surrounded me. I threw down herbs from Billy's bag, and they backed away howling. But the Alpha walked right through them, up close. I could see where its wolf face merged with human features. It spoke, its voice like gravel. Join us, or die. I had one silver bullet left. The eclipse was almost complete. I could feel the power building around us. The doorway starting to open. The Alpha reached for me, its claws gleaming. Then I remembered what Billy had said about the medicine bag. It'll cost a price. I ripped it open and threw the sacred stones into the Alpha's open mouth. They blazed like fire in its throat. As it staggered, I fired my last bullet straight into its heart. The Alpha's roar shook the mountains. As it fell, the other dogmen started changing, some dying, some turning back into people. The doorway collapsed, and the red moon began to brighten again. But before I could feel relieved, I felt a burning pain in my leg. During the fight, one of them had bitten me. It's been 3 months since that night. The official story says it was a mass animal attack. The survivors who turned back to human don't remember anything. Or if they do, they're not talking. The park is quiet again, but different somehow. Darker. I had to quit my ranger job. The bite changed me. Not completely, but enough. Every full moon, I feel the pull. My senses are sharper now. I can smell a deer from a mile away. Hear heartbeats in the dark. Sometimes I wake up with dirt under my fingernails and no memory of the night before. The herbs from Billy's bag help me fight it. I make tea from them every day. It burns going down, but it keeps me human. Mostly. I live in a cabin deep in the mountains now, far from people, just in case. The other day, I found fresh tracks near my cabin, bigger than a normal wolf's, but smaller than the dogmen I fought. The Alpha's children, maybe, or others of its kind. They're still out there, watching, waiting. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I hear howling in the distance. Part of me wants to answer. That's the part one fight hardest against. I keep my rifle loaded with silver bullets now. One day, I might need to use the last one on myself. But until then, I guard these mountains, because I'm the only one who knows the truth, the only one who can stop it if they try to return. And every time I see the moon turn red, I remember Steve's eyes at the end, human eyes in a wolf's face, and I know I made the right choice. Some prices are worth paying to keep the monsters at bay, even if you have to become one yourself to do it. My name is Frank Winters, and I've been a park ranger here in White Mountain National Forest for almost 15 years now. Most people think being a ranger just means telling folks not to feed the bears or helping lost hikers find their way back to the trail. But up here in New Hampshire, especially during winter, This job can be the difference between life and death. I live alone in my cabin. Just me and the woods. It's been that way since Sarah, my wife, passed away from cancer 2 years ago. The only thing I have left of her is this silver locket I always carry in my pocket. Some days I open it just to look at her smiling face, and somehow it makes me feel braver, like she's still watching over me. The other rangers call me the winter rescue specialist. Fancy words for saying I'm good at finding people in snowstorms. After 20 years as a Marine and 15 more in these mountains, I've gotten pretty good at keeping people alive in the cold. At least, that's what I thought until that first snow in November. It started with 3 missing hikers. Nothing unusual there. People get lost in these mountains all the time. But something felt different about this case. The temperature had dropped way too low, even for November. I'm talking about the kind of cold that makes your bones ache and freezes your breath before it leaves your mouth. The first weird thing I noticed were the tracks in the snow. They looked human, but were huge, bigger than any footprint I'd ever seen, and they just stopped. Right in the middle of an open clearing, like whatever made them had just disappeared into thin air. Then came the howling, not like wolves or coyotes. This was different. It sounded almost human, but wrong, like someone trying to copy a person's voice, but not quite getting it right. But what really got to me were the dead animals we started finding. I've seen plenty of animal kills in my time. Bears, mountain lions, wolves. But these were different. The bodies looked like they'd been cut open with surgical precision. Organs removed like someone had carefully picked them out. No animal I know hunts like that. I radioed back to base about what I'd found, but I didn't tell them everything. How could I explain the way the air felt heavy with something more than just cold, or how the wind seemed to whisper words I could almost understand, or that feeling in my gut? The same feeling I used to get in the Marines right before all hell broke loose? Sarah would have said I was just being paranoid, but Sarah wasn't here anymore, and I had 3 missing hikers to find. What I didn't know then was that this was just the beginning. Those 3 missing people would soon become 9. And I was about to learn that some legends of these mountains aren't just stories to scare children around campfires. Looking back now, I wish I'd paid more attention to the signs. Maybe then I could have prevented what happened next. But when you've spent as much time in these mountains as I have, you start to think you know all their secrets. I was about to learn just how wrong I was. The next morning, I decided to visit Joe Running Bear, an old friend who knew these mountains better than anyone. He lived in a small house at the edge of the forest, and if anyone could make sense of what was happening, it would be him. Joe took one look at the photos of the tracks I'd found, and his face went pale. He walked to his bookshelf and pulled out an old leather book, its pages yellow with age. Inside were drawings made by his ancestors, showing something that made my stomach turn. A tall, skeletal creature with antlers and glowing eyes. "This is the White Walker," Joe said quietly, his fingers tracing the ancient drawings. "My people have known about it for generations. It comes with the first snow, hunting those who wander too far into its territory." I wanted to laugh it off. In all my years as a ranger, I'd heard plenty of stories about monsters in these woods, but the way Joe's hands shook as he turned the pages told me this was different. That's when my radio crackled to life. Through the static, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was Sarah's voice, calling my name. But Sarah was gone, had been for 2 years. The voice called again, begging for help, and I nearly dropped the radio. Joe grabbed my arm. That's how it hunts. He whispered, it uses the voices of those we've lost to lure us in. Before I could process what he meant, another call came through. This time it was Tom Phillips, one of our deputy rangers. He was out searching the North Ridge, and his voice was shaking. Frank, something's wrong up here, he said. The temperature, it's dropping so fast. The trees are freezing solid. I've never seen anything like, oh God. The radio went dead. I rushed to my truck. But Joe stopped me. You can't go alone, he said. The White Walker grows stronger with each victim. 6 more people have vanished in the last 3 days. It's getting ready for something big. I don't believe in monsters, I told him. But even as I said it, I felt the weight of Sarah's locket in my pocket, remembering all the strange things I'd seen lately. Joe pressed something into my hand, a small pouch filled with herbs and what looked like salt, silver and sage. He explained, it won't kill it, but it might slow it down. And Frank, whatever you hear out there, whatever voices call to you, don't trust them. As I drove toward the North Ridge, the sky grew darker than it should have been for midday. The snow was falling harder now, but something was wrong with it. Each flake seemed to glow with a faint blue light, and the wind carried whispers that sounded like crying. I kept telling myself there had to be a logical explanation for everything. The tracks, the dead animals, the voices on the radio. But deep down, I knew I was about to face something that no amount of military training or ranger experience had prepared me for. I found Tom's truck first. It was covered in a thick layer of ice, like someone had frozen it solid. The driver's door was open, and Tom's radio lay in the snow, still crackling with static. The cold hit me like a wall. It had to be at least 30 below zero, way colder than it should have been. That's when I heard the crunch of footsteps in the snow behind me. I turned around slowly, my flashlight beam cutting through the falling snow. At first, I thought I was looking at a dead tree, tall and white, with branches reaching up into the dark sky. Then it moved. It wasn't a tree. The thing stood at least 12 feet tall, its body skinny like someone who hadn't eaten in years. Its skin was white as the snow, stretched tight over bones that looked like ice. But its eyes, they glowed bright blue, like the heart of a glacier, and on its head were antlers, huge ones, covered in frost. Frank, it whispered in Sarah's voice, and my heart nearly stopped. Why didn't you save me? Frank. I stumbled backward, nearly falling. The creature took a step forward, and the ground under its feet turned to solid ice. The snow around us began to swirl, creating a wall of white that blocked everything else from view. Stay back, I yelled, pulling out my gun. But as I fired, the bullets just seemed to pass right through it, like shooting at smoke. The thing, the White Walker, moved faster than anything that big should be able to move. In seconds, it was right in front of me. The cold coming off, it was so intense that my eyes started to freeze shut. I remembered the pouch Joe had given me and threw it as hard as I could. The herbs and salt hit the creature's chest, and it let out a screech that shook icicles from the trees. It gave me just enough time to run. I sprinted through the woods, branches whipping at my face. Behind me, I could hear it coming, its footsteps making the ground shake. The temperature kept dropping, and my lungs burned with each breath of frozen air. I made it to a small cave I knew about, one of our emergency shelters. Inside, I found Maria Ramirez, our wildlife expert, huddled near the remains of a fire. She looked up at me with terrified eyes. I saw it. Frank. She whispered. It took the others, turned them to ice, and she couldn't finish the sentence. Before I could answer, a blast of Arctic wind howled through the cave entrance. The temperature plummeted so fast that the walls began to crack. Maria screamed, and I turned just in time to see the white walker filling the cave entrance, its antlers scraping the ceiling. This time, it spoke with Tom's voice. "You can't save them, Frank. You can't save any of them." The thing raised its hand, and spikes of ice burst from the cave floor. I dove to the side. But Maria wasn't fast enough. The ice went right through her, and in seconds, her body was frozen solid. Then, with a sound like breaking glass, she shattered into 1,000 pieces. I ran deeper into the cave system, the creature's laughter echoing behind me. My fingers found Sarah's locket in my pocket, and for a moment I felt a warmth that pushed back against the overwhelming cold. I needed to find a way to stop this thing, and I needed to do it fast, because if I didn't, there wouldn't be anyone left in these mountains to save. The caves led me back out to a different part of the forest. My radio crackled again, this time with Peter Walsh's voice, our rookie ranger. He was alive but hurt bad. I found him half a mile away, sheltering under a fallen tree. His legs were black with frostbite, and his face was pale as a ghost. "It's been hunting us like we're rabbits," he said through chattering teeth. "Johnson, Martinez, the whole search party, they're all gone." I gave Peter my coat and called for emergency pickup. That's when I heard Joe running bare, calling from nearby. He was walking through the snow, carrying an old wooden box. "Frank," he shouted, "I found it, what my grandfather wrote about the White Walker, but something wasn't right." Joe's voice was too loud, too clear in the howling wind. I remembered what he told me earlier. "Don't trust the voices." "Peter," I whispered, "cover your ears." The thing that looked like Joe smiled, and its face melted in seconds. The White Walker stood there instead, its blue eyes glowing with hunger. Peter screamed. I grabbed a flare from my belt and lit it. The creature hissed at the bright red flame, backing away just long enough for us to make it to my truck. As I started the engine, the real Joe's voice came through on the radio. "Frank, are you there? I know how to stop it." I looked at Peter. His eyes were wide with fear, but he nodded. This was the real Joe, the White Walker's heart. Joe said, his voice breaking up with static, "It's made of the first ice that ever froze in these mountains. That's why it hunts during the first snow. It's when it's strongest, but it's also when it's most vulnerable." "How do we kill it?" I asked, driving as fast as I dared through the storm. "You need something pure, something with real love in it," Joe said, "and you need fire, lots of it." The ice heart can only melt if the radio went dead. Through the swirling snow, I saw something huge moving in front of my truck. I swerved, but the road was pure ice. We spun out, crashing into a tree. Peter was knocked out cold, blood running down his face. As I pulled him from the wreck, I felt Sarah's locket grow warm in my pocket. Something pure, Joe had said. Something with real love in it. I squeezed the locket tight, remembering Sarah's smile, her laugh, her love. I knew what I had to do, but first, I needed to get Peter somewhere safe. And I needed fire, lots of fire. I half-carried Peter to an old Park Service cabin nearby. Inside, I found emergency supplies and a radio that still worked. I called in a rescue helicopter for Peter, then gathered everything I could find that would burn: lantern oil, emergency flares, and old maps. "Don't go back out there." Peter grabbed my arm, his voice weak. "It's suicide." Frank. Maybe it was. But as I heard the helicopter approaching for Peter, I knew I had to end this tonight. More people would die if I didn't. I doused my heavy winter coat in lantern oil and grabbed the flares. The helicopter had barely taken off with Peter when I heard it. Sarah's voice again, calling from the direction of the frozen lake. The White Walker was waiting for me there. The lake's surface was completely frozen, glowing with that same eerie blue light as the creature's eyes. The thing stood in the middle, its antlers reaching up into the swirling snow. "You've brought warmth," it said, but this time in its own voice, a sound like cracking ice. How brave, how foolish. I clutched Sarah's locket in one hand and a flare in the other. "You don't get to use her voice anymore," I said. "You don't get to hurt anyone else." It moved fast, sending spikes of ice shooting up from the lake. I rolled away, feeling them slice through my clothes. The cold was so intense I could barely breathe. But I kept moving. I had to get closer. The creature swung its long arms, razor-sharp icicles flying from its fingers. One caught my leg, and I felt hot blood freeze instantly on my skin. But I was close enough now. I lit the flare and threw it at the monster's feet. The bright red light made it stumble back. That's when I saw it, in the center of its chest. A piece of ice that looked older than the mountains themselves, pulsing with a pale blue glow. Now or never. I lit my oil-soaked coat on fire and ran straight at the creature. The flames spread up my arms, and the pain was unbelievable. But I kept going. The White Walker shrieked, trying to back away from the heat. I slammed into it with all my strength, wrapping my burning arms around its frozen body. With one hand, I pressed Sarah's locket right against its ice heart. The creature's scream shook the entire lake. Cracks spread through the ice beneath us as the locket began to glow with a warm, golden light, the same warmth I always felt when thinking about Sarah's love. The White Walker's ice heart started to melt, dripping away like tears. It thrashed and fought, but I held on, even as my skin burned and froze at the same time. The last thing I remember was falling through the cracking ice, still holding tight to the creature as everything went black. I woke up 3 weeks later in the hospital. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive. Most of my body was covered in burns, and I had severe frostbite. They couldn't explain how I survived being in that frozen lake for nearly an hour before the rescue team found me. Peter made it too, though he lost both his legs to the frostbite. He visits me sometimes at my new house in town. We don't talk much about what happened that night. How could we? Who would believe us? They never found the bodies of the others, Tom, Maria, or the hikers. The official report says they were lost to extreme weather conditions. Maybe that's easier for people to accept. Joe Running Bear helped me search the lake bottom when spring came. We didn't find the White Walker's body, but we did find something strange, a patch of lake water that never thaws, even in the hottest summer days. Sarah's locket was gone too, lost in the fight. But sometimes I think I can feel its warmth, like she's still watching over me. I retired from the ranger service after that winter. Some might call it running away, but I like to think Sarah would understand. I still live near the mountains, though someone needs to be here to warn others when the first snow comes, because even now, years later, I sometimes hear strange sounds on cold November nights, and every year, when the first snowflake falls, the temperature drops just a little too quickly, and the wind whispers just a little too loudly. You see, Joe told me something else about the White Walker. The old stories say it can't really die. Not completely. As long as there's snow in these mountains, a part of it will always survive, waiting for the right moment to grow strong again. So I keep watching, I keep listening, and most importantly, I keep a box of flares by my front door, just in case, because up here in the White Mountains, the first snow brings more than just winter, and someone needs to be ready when it does. My name is Marcus Coleman, and after 20 years as a cave rescue specialist here at Mammoth Cave National Park, I thought I'd seen everything. I was wrong, dead wrong. What I'm about to tell you changed my life forever, and sometimes I wish I could forget it all. But the world needs to know what's lurking in the darkness below. I've spent most of my life exploring caves. Started as a geologist, then became a park ranger, and finally specialized in cave rescues. The limestone caverns of Kentucky became my second home. Well, they were, until last summer when everything went wrong during a routine rescue that nearly killed me. Since then, even thinking about tight spaces makes my heart race. The doctors call it claustrophobia. I call it common sense. Our bodies aren't meant to be trapped underground. But when duty calls, you answer. That's what my dad taught me. Even though I wasn't such a great father myself. My son Tommy hasn't spoken to me since the divorce 3 years ago. Can't blame him. I missed too many birthdays, too many school events. Always putting the job first. It all started on a warm Tuesday morning in July. I was doing paperwork in my office, boring stuff about trail maintenance, when Sarah from dispatch burst through my door. Her face was white as a sheet. "Marcus, we've got a problem," she said, her voice shaking. A tour group of 12 people went missing in the new section of the cave system. They're 3 hours overdue. I felt my stomach tighten. The new section had only been discovered last month, and we were still mapping it. Tourist groups weren't supposed to go there yet. Who was their guide? I asked, already reaching for my gear. "That's the thing," Sarah replied. "They didn't have one. They went in on their own." I cursed under my breath. As I gathered my equipment, Sarah shared more disturbing news. The science team had found strange carvings on the cave walls yesterday, ancient drawings showing what looked like human-like creatures living underground. And over the past week, our seismic monitors had been picking up weird vibrations from deep below. But the detail that really got to me was about the bats. Our wildlife team had found dozens of dead ones near the cave entrance. Something had torn them apart. And it wasn't any animal we knew. As I checked my flashlight batteries, I noticed the temperature reading on my office thermometer. It showed 85 degrees, way too hot for this time of year in the caves. They usually stay a cool 54 degrees year-round. I tried to ignore the voice in my head, screaming that something was terribly wrong. 12 lives were at stake. My hands shook slightly as I packed my rescue gear, but I forced myself to breathe slowly, pushing down the panic that had been my constant companion since the accident. Little did I know, I was about to lead my team into something far worse than any of us could have imagined. I assembled my rescue team quickly. Dr. Linda Morrison, our cave expert, was first to volunteer. She'd been studying Mammoth Cave for over 20 years and knew its twists and turns better than anyone. Billy Thompson, our local guide, joined next. Young guy, but he had good instincts. Dr. Richard Hayes, the geologist, insisted on coming. He wanted to study those strange carvings. Jack Wilson, another park ranger and my best friend, stepped up without hesitation. Mike Denver, an experienced spelunker who often helped with rescues, rounded out our team of 6. As we geared up at the cave entrance, I noticed everyone was unusually quiet. The air felt heavy, and not just from the unusual heat coming from the cave mouth. Our flashlight beams cut through the morning mist as we did our final equipment checks. "Remember," I said, checking my radio one last time, "we stay together. No wandering off. No matter what we find down there." Standard rescue protocol. We entered the main cave passage at 9:15 a.m. The familiar limestone walls that usually brought me comfort now felt different somehow. Our footsteps echoed strangely, as if the cave itself was holding its breath. The temperature kept rising as we went deeper, and our instruments showed readings that made no sense. An hour in, we found the first sign of the missing group, a dropped water bottle with a fresh tourist map. But something was off. The bottle had deep scratches on it, like claw marks, but bigger than any cave creature I'd ever seen. "Marcus," Linda called out softly, her flashlight beam fixed on the wall. "You need to see this." I walked over and felt my blood run cold. There, carved into the limestone, were the petroglyphs Sarah had mentioned. But these weren't just simple drawings. They showed tall, thin figures with long arms and huge, empty eye sockets. Below them were smaller figures, human figures, being dragged into dark holes. "These aren't recent," Linda whispered, running her fingers over the carvings. "These are ancient. But look at the tool marks. They're deeper than any prehistoric human could have made with stone tools." That's when we heard it, a sound that still haunts my dreams. From somewhere in the darkness ahead came a low, vibrating hum, so deep we felt it more than heard it, and with it, ever so faintly, what sounded like whispering voices. Mike grabbed my arm. "Did you hear that?" Before I could answer, our radios crackled with static. All of our equipment started acting strange. compasses spinning wildly, depth meters showing impossible readings. Even our newest flashlights began to flicker. We pushed deeper into the cave, following a trail of scattered belongings. A backpack here, a camera there. Each item had those same strange claw marks. The air got thicker, harder to breathe, and that humming sound grew stronger. Then we found the first body. It was one of the tourists, or what was left of him. I won't describe what we saw. Some things are better left unsaid. But I will say this. No animal I know could have done that to a person. Linda bent down to examine the scene, her hands shaking. Marcus, look at these marks. There. Deliberate, like some kind of ritual. That's when Billy spotted the opening, a crack in the wall we'd never seen before, leading down into a deeper chamber. As we shone our lights inside, the beam revealed something that stopped us all cold. Steps, ancient, worn steps carved into the rock, leading down into darkness. This isn't natural, Dr. Hayes whispered, running his hand along the smooth stone walls. These are man-made, but according to our records, no one's ever been down here before. The humming grew louder, and with it came a new sound, a clicking noise, like someone tapping bones together. It seemed to come from all around us. Our flashlights dimmed again, and in that moment of darkness, I swear I saw something move along the walls, something tall and thin, disappearing around a corner. Jack's voice cracked as he spoke. We need to go down there, don't we? I nodded, fighting back my own fear. 12 people are still missing. We have to find them. As we started down those ancient steps, the clicking sounds grew closer, and then we heard something that made my blood freeze, a scream, echoing up from below. It was Linda. We rushed down the steps, our lights bouncing off the walls. Linda had disappeared around a corner. When we reached the bottom, we found ourselves in a massive chamber, bigger than any we'd mapped before. Our lights couldn't even reach the ceiling. Linda, I called out. My voice echoed back, but there was no answer. Then we saw them, in the far corner of the chamber. Our lights caught movement. Tall, pale figures slipped between the shadows, moving in ways that weren't right, like spiders on the walls. Their skin looked almost see-through, and where their eyes should have been, there were just dark, empty holes. Billy threw up. I don't blame him. The creatures moved closer, making those clicking sounds with their long, sharp teeth. They didn't need light to see us. They were using sound to hunt, like bats, but much more advanced. Dr. Hayes started muttering to himself, covering his ears. That humming sound was getting louder, and my head started to feel fuzzy. Later, we learned these creatures could make sounds that messed with our minds, making us see things that weren't there. We need to move, Jack shouted, but his voice sounded far away. That's when we found the missing tourists. They were alive, but I wish I hadn't seen what the creatures were doing to them. They had them in some kind of cocoons, stuck to the walls, some kind of breeding chamber. We realized later the creatures were changing them somehow. Mike tried to reach one of the tourists, but the creatures were faster. They grabbed him with their long arms and pulled him into the darkness. His screams echoed for what felt like forever, then stopped suddenly. Dr. Hayes couldn't take it. The humming was driving him crazy. Before any of us could stop him, he turned his knife on himself. Jack tried to save him, but those things were waiting for their chance. They swarmed him. I'll never forget his last words. "Run. Marcus. Tell people what's down here." I grabbed Billy's arm and pulled him toward a tunnel I spotted. We could hear the creatures following, their clicks getting closer. The walls seemed to close in around us, and my old fear of tight spaces started creeping back. But I couldn't let it stop me now. Not with those things behind us. We ran until we found ourselves in a huge chamber that looked like some kind of underground cathedral. Ancient columns reached up into the darkness, covered in those same strange carvings. In the center was a pit that seemed to go down forever, and the walls were lined with thousands of those cocoons. That's when Billy lost it. "We're going to die down here," he screamed. His voice echoed off the walls, and the clicking sounds stopped suddenly. The silence was worse. "Listen to me," I whispered, grabbing his shoulders. "My light. These things hate bright light. Haven't you noticed how they stay in the shadows?" But before we could make a plan, they came, dozens of them, crawling down the walls like pale spiders. Billy tried to run, but they caught him. I won't write down what they did to him. His screams still wake me up at night. I was alone now. My breathing got faster as the walls seemed to close in. But then I thought about my son Tommy, about how I needed to make it out to warn everyone, to make things right with him. I had one last flare in my pack. Looking up, I saw the chamber's ceiling was covered in loose rocks. The creatures were getting closer, their humming trying to mess with my head. But I had a plan. I lit the flare. The bright light sent them screeching back into the shadows. I threw it as hard as I could at the ceiling, right where the rocks looked weakest. The explosion echoed through the chamber. For a second, nothing happened. Then the ceiling started to crack. No! The creatures screamed, actually screamed, in human voices. But it was too late. The whole chamber began to collapse. Huge rocks crashed down, crushing the cocoons and the creatures. The humming turned into a horrible shriek that made my ears hurt. I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, through tunnels that seemed to get smaller and smaller. Rocks were falling everywhere. My lungs burned, but I could hear them behind me, chasing me, their clicks getting closer and closer. I saw light ahead, real daylight, the cave entrance. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't breathe, but I forced myself to keep moving. Just as I reached the entrance, a final explosion of rocks sealed the tunnel behind me. I collapsed outside, gasping for air. The rescue team found me there an hour later. They said I was covered in dirt and blood, talking about monsters in the dark. Nobody believed me at first, but they believe me now. The scientists found the sealed tunnel, and the strange readings are still coming from deep underground. Sometimes, late at night, people hear that humming sound coming from the sealed cave entrances, and every month, more cattle go missing from nearby farms. I quit my job at the park. Some nights, I wake up thinking I hear those clicks in the dark corners of my room. But something good did come from all this horror. Tommy came to see me in the hospital. We talked for hours. Really talked. For the first time in years. He lives with me now. The official report says the missing tourists died in a cave collapse. Maybe that's better. The world's not ready to know what's really down there, in the darkness below. But I know the truth. Those creatures are still there, behind the rocks, breeding, waiting, and someday, those rocks won't be enough to hold them back. So if you're ever in a cave and hear a strange humming sound, or see movement in the dark where there shouldn't be any, don't stop to investigate. Run. Run as fast as you can toward the light, and pray they haven't sealed off your escape route, because in the darkness below, something is waiting, something that's been waiting for a very long time. My name is Catherine Reynolds, but everyone calls me Kate. This happened to me in 1988, when I was working as a senior park ranger at Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina. I had just moved there from Colorado, trying to start fresh after, well, let's just say after things went wrong during a rescue mission back in the Rockies. I was good at my job, really good, before becoming a ranger. I used to climb in the Olympics, and those skills came in handy more times than I can count. The transfer to Pisgah seemed perfect. Quiet forest, friendly people, lots of history and local stories to learn about. Just what I needed to heal. But sometimes the quiet places hide the darkest secrets. I remember exactly when it all started. A cool September morning when two hikers came running into my station, white as sheets. They were babbling about bodies hanging from trees that disappeared when they got closer. I thought they were just spooked by shadows or old branches. I had no idea that morning would be the beginning of the most terrifying experience of my life, one that would change me forever. First, I thought the hikers were just being dramatic. We get that sometimes, people spooked by shadows or weird-looking trees. But something in their eyes made me uneasy. They weren't the type to scare easily. Both were experienced backpackers who'd been coming to Pisgah for years. I grabbed my gear and headed out to check their hiking route. The morning was unusually quiet. No birds singing. No squirrels rustling in the leaves. Just the sound of my boots crunching on the trail. The air felt heavy, like right before a storm. About 2 miles in, I found the first strange thing. Deep claw marks on a massive oak tree, maybe 40 feet up. They weren't from a bear, too high, too deep. The bark was still fresh and bleeding sap. Whatever made those marks had done it recently. Then I heard it, children laughing, clear as day, coming from deeper in the forest. But that was impossible. This trail had been closed for maintenance, and there weren't any camps nearby. I called out, but only silence answered. As I walked further, things got weirder. I found a dead fox tangled in the branches of a young pine tree, at least 15 feet up. No way it could have gotten there naturally. And the trees. Maybe it was just my imagination, but they seemed different each time I looked back, like they had shifted slightly when I wasn't watching. By sunset, I had filled my notebook with things that didn't make sense, paths that led to dead ends that weren't on any map, plants growing in impossible patterns, and the constant feeling of being watched. When I finally headed back to the station, I knew one thing for certain. Something was very wrong in my forest. I started digging into old records about the forest. Dr. Mark Stevens, our local botanist, joined me. He was a quiet guy with thick glasses who knew every plant in Pisgah by name. We spent hours going through dusty files in the ranger station basement. "Kate, look at this," Mark said one evening, showing me a yellowed newspaper from 1922. People had gone missing in these woods before. Lots of them, every few decades. Like clockwork. The stories were always the same. Hikers vanished. Others reported seeing strange shapes in the trees. And the forest paths seemed to change overnight. Emily White, the town historian, had more to share. She told us about an old Native American legend, a spirit that lived in the heart of the forest, one that could control the trees themselves. I usually don't believe in such things, but after what I'd seen, then Mark disappeared. We found his backpack near an old oak tree, the ground around it covered in strange, twisted vines. The search team, 5 of our best rangers, went looking for him. Tim Ross, my fellow ranger, led them into the forest. Only Tim came back, and he wasn't the same. His eyes were different, empty somehow. He kept talking about the trees moving, about seeing Mark's face in the bark. I thought he was losing his mind until I saw it too, a hand reaching out from inside a tree trunk, then vanishing like it was never there. That's when I knew we weren't dealing with anything normal. Whatever was in my forest was getting bolder, and we were running out of time. I found Tim's body 3 days later. He was hanging from a tree branch 30 feet up, wrapped in vines. But that wasn't the worst part. His skin had started turning into bark, and his fingers had grown into twisted branches. I threw up when I saw it. The tourists came next, a family of 3 who ignored the trail-closed signs. We heard their screams at sunset. By the time I got there, the forest had changed them. They were still alive, sort of, but their bodies were half tree, faces frozen in permanent screams. Emily White tried to help. She found an old journal that talked about the forest spirit's weakness, something about a heart tree and a solar eclipse. But before she could tell me more, they found her body bent backwards around a tree trunk, like a doll twisted by an angry child. The forest was changing faster now. Trees grew overnight, their branches reaching like fingers. Paths disappeared. Maps became useless. And everywhere I looked, I saw faces in the bark. Mark, Tim, Emily, the tourists, all watching, all suffering. I started hearing whispers at night. The thing in the forest was learning, growing stronger. It showed itself to me once, a massive shape made of twisted wood and rotting leaves, with too many limbs and a face that looked almost human. But its eyes, God, its eyes were like looking into a deep, dark well filled with moving shadows. I knew what I had to do. Emily's notes mentioned a heart tree, the source of the spirit's power, and there was going to be a solar eclipse the next day. It was my only chance. I packed my old climbing gear and waited until sunrise. The forest was eerily quiet as I followed the twisted vines along the ground. They all led to one place, a massive, ancient oak in a clearing I'd never seen before. The heart tree was huge, its trunk covered in faces of everyone we'd lost. As the eclipse started, everything went wrong. The tree, it came alive. Branches shot out like spears. The ground burst open as roots tried to grab me. And the spirit, it split into dozens of copies, each one made of wood and rotting flesh. I started climbing, using every skill from my Olympic days. The tree fought back, Vines whipped at my face. Branches tried to knock me down. The faces in the bark screamed. But I kept going up, 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 even as the forest itself tried to stop me. At the eclipse's peak, I reached the top. The heart was there, a pulsing mass of wood and glowing sap. I pulled out my flare gun, took aim, and fired. The tree erupted in flames. The spirit screamed, not like a person, but like wind through 1,000 dead trees. Everything went black. When I woke up, the forest was quiet again, but something had changed. Not just in the woods, but in me too. That was 15 years ago. I'm still a ranger at Pisgah, but things are different now. The forest talks to me sometimes, not with words, but I can feel what it wants. The plants grow strangely when I'm around. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I see familiar faces in the trees. They quarantined the area where it all happened, but it didn't matter. The spirit isn't dead. It's just changed, spread out. I've seen new growths popping up miles away. Trees with bark that looks too much like skin. Flowers that turn to follow you like eyes. The missing people, they're still here, part of the forest now. Sometimes I think I hear Mark's laugh in the rustling leaves, or see Emily's smile in a twisted branch. The tourists' children play among the shadows when no one's watching. As for me, well, let's just say I'm not quite the same Kate Reynolds who first came to Pisgah. The forest marked me that day. Now, when I touch a tree, I feel its heartbeat. When the wind blows, I understand its whispers. But here's the scariest part. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself wondering if I really won that day, or if the forest just found a new way to spread. Because every time I leave Pisgah, the plants around me start growing differently, and sometimes, just sometimes, I catch my reflection in a window and see bark starting to creep across my skin. My name is Howard Mitchell, but everyone calls me Hank. This happened to me back in 1992, when I was working as the search and rescue coordinator at Mount Rainier National Park in Washington. I still don't know if anyone will believe my story, but I need to share what happened up there in the fog. Before all this started, I was pretty good at my job. Actually, I was the best. In 15 years of rescue work, I had never lost anyone on my watch. The other rangers used to joke that I could find a needle in a mountain of haystacks. I guess that came from my time in Vietnam, where I learned how to track and survive in the worst conditions you can imagine. But everything changed 6 months before the fog came. My daughter Jenny, she was only 16. She loved hiking these trails with me, knew them like the back of her hand. But that day, that one terrible day, she went alone while I was working. There was a rock slide. By the time we found her, well, let's just say I wasn't fast enough that time. Some wounds never heal, and losing Jenny left a hole in my heart that nothing could fill. I threw myself into my work after that. Every rescue mission became personal. Every lost hiker was someone else's Jenny, and I wasn't going to let another family feel what I felt. The mountains became both my escape and my prison. I couldn't leave them, but being here hurt every single day. The park was my home, though I knew every trail, every cave, Every dangerous spot where people might get into trouble. Mount Rainier isn't forgiving. She's beautiful, but she can be deadly if you don't respect her. At 14, 411 feet high, the mountain creates its own weather. We get fog here all the time. But what happened that October was different. Very different. I remember the morning it all began. The air felt wrong somehow. Heavy and cold in a way I'd never felt before. The birds had gone quiet, and in all my years on the mountain, I'd learned that when the animals go quiet, something bad is coming. I just didn't know then that this something would change everything, not just for me, but for everyone who dared to enter what we started calling the fog zone. If I had known what was hiding in that mist, well, maybe I could have saved more of them. Or maybe we were all doomed from the start. IT started on a Tuesday morning. I was in my office going through some paperwork when Sarah Williams, one of our rangers, burst through the door. Her face was pale, and her hands were shaking. "Hank, you need to see this," she said, her voice trembling. "There's something weird about the fog in Section B. I've seen hundreds of fog banks in my time here, but when I stepped outside, I knew this was different. The fog wasn't moving like normal fog should. It just sat there, thick and white, like a wall of cotton. And it was cold, the kind of cold that seeps right into your bones. We got our first warning call an hour later. A family of hikers said their phones died all at once when they got near the fog. Then their compass started spinning in circles. Luckily, they were smart enough to turn back, but others weren't so careful. Bob Turner, our most experienced guide, took a group of 4 up the trail that afternoon. When they didn't check in that evening, I knew something was wrong. Bob never missed a check-in. Never. I grabbed my radio to coordinate a search, but it just made static noises when I got close to the fog. Even our emergency satellite phones wouldn't work. It was like the fog was eating up all the signals. Then the animals started acting strange. I saw a herd of deer running down the mountain like something was chasing them. Birds flew away in huge flocks. Even the squirrels and chipmunks disappeared. In all my years as a ranger, I'd never seen anything like it. Dr. Paul Harper, the meteorologist from the weather station, came down to check it out. He kept saying this wasn't normal weather behavior. The fog should have cleared up by afternoon, but it just stayed there, getting thicker. There's no scientific explanation for this, he told me, adjusting his glasses nervously. The temperature inside the fog is dropping way below what it should be, and it's not moving with the wind patterns. That night, we heard the first screams. They came from somewhere inside the fog, high-pitched and terrified. I grabbed my gear and was ready to go in, but Sheriff Cooper stopped me. "Wait till morning," he said. "We can't help anyone if we get lost in there too." He was right, but I couldn't sleep that night. I sat in my cabin, watching the fog through my window, and that's when I saw them for the first time, lights moving inside the mist. Not flashlights or headlamps, but something else, something that made my skin crawl. They looked like tiny blue flames dancing in the fog, moving in ways that nothing natural should move. And as I watched, I could have sworn I heard whispers, soft, calling voices that reminded me of Jenny. By morning, the fog had spread another mile down the mountain, and Bob Turner's group still hadn't returned. I knew then that whatever was happening, it wasn't just bad weather. Something was very, very wrong on our mountain, and I had no idea how many people we were going to lose before we figured out what it was. The next morning, I decided I had to go into the fog myself. Dr. Harper insisted on coming with me, saying he needed to take readings or something scientific like that. We tied ourselves together with a rope, just like mountain climbers do, and took our first steps into the white wall. The moment we entered, everything felt wrong. The fog wasn't wet like normal fog. It felt dry and somehow alive. Our flashlights barely worked, making weird shadows all around us. The cold was worse inside, like being stuck in a freezer. "Look at this," Dr. Harper whispered, holding up a small device. "The temperature's dropping fast. It's impossible." Those were his last normal words. We'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when I heard him gasp. When I turned around, I saw something that still gives me nightmares. There was a shape in the fog, like smoke but darker, moving towards Harper. Before I could pull him away, it passed right through him like he was made of paper. Harper screamed. His skin turned grey, and I could see right through him, like he was becoming fog himself. Then he just dissolved, right in front of my eyes. 1 minute he was there, the next, nothing but empty clothes falling to the ground. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. 20 years of rescue experience, and I ran like a scared kid. But as I was running, I saw them, the creatures. They were floating in the fog, sort of see-through but with shapes like people. Some were tall, some small, all of them hungry-looking. The worst part, one of them looked just like Jenny, back at the ranger station. Nobody believed me at first, but then Sarah came running in. She'd seen them too, while checking the lower trails, and she said something that made my blood freeze. "They're learning, Hank," she said, her voice shaking. "They're making shapes we recognize. Yesterday, I saw what looked like a lost hiker waving for help, but when I got closer, she couldn't finish the sentence. More reports started coming in. Hikers found drained completely dry, like all the water had been sucked out of them. Others just disappeared. The fog kept growing, eating up more of our mountain every day. The creatures were getting smarter too. They started making noises, voices calling for help, children crying, sounds that made you want to go deeper into the fog to rescue someone. But there was never anyone to rescue, just those things, waiting in the white. I knew we had to do something, but how do you fight something you can't even touch? Something that can walk through walls and turn people into empty shells? That's when I remembered something from my Vietnam days, about how cold affects the enemy's movement. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to fight these things. But first, we had to survive the night, and from the way the fog was moving down the mountain, I knew this night was going to be the worst one yet. Things got really bad really fast. The creatures weren't just floating around anymore. They were hunting us. Sheriff Cooper was the first one we lost that night. He went to check on some campers who hadn't come back. Even though I begged him to wait until morning, we found his body the next day. But it was wrong, like someone had turned him inside out. I've seen some horrible things in my life, But nothing like that. Sarah changed after seeing what happened to Cooper. She started acting strange, talking in a voice that wasn't quite hers. One minute she'd be normal. The next she'd be staring at nothing with empty eyes. I knew the fog things had gotten to her somehow. They're in my head. Hank. She told me one evening. Crying. They show me things. Terrible things. They want me to help them get more people. The next day, she tried to lead a tourist family into the fog. We had to lock her in the medical room. But by morning, she was gone, just vanished, leaving behind a room full of frost. Bob Turner's body showed up 3 days after he disappeared. He looked like a dried-up leaf, all wrinkly and brown. The 4 people who were with him, we never found them. The fog took them completely. I started noticing patterns. The creatures were strongest when it was cold. They used the fog like a net, spreading it out to trap people. Then they'd make shapes or sounds to draw people in. A lost child crying, a friend calling for help, even park rangers giving directions. But it was never real, just tricks to catch more victims. One night, I saw them practicing their tricks. They were taking shapes from our memories, things they found in the minds of people they'd taken. That's when I realized why I kept seeing Jenny in the fog. They were using her to get to me. The research team that came to study the fog, all 4 of them disappeared in 1 hour. Their equipment was left behind, covered in ice, still recording. The recordings just showed static and weird whispers that made your head hurt if you listened too long. We tried everything to stop the fog from spreading. Fire hoses, industrial fans, even helicopter downdrafts. Nothing worked. The fog just kept coming, getting thicker, getting smarter. People started calling it the fog that eats people. The news didn't believe us at first, but after 20 people vanished in 1 week, they couldn't ignore it anymore. The park officials wanted to close everything down, but by then it was too late. The fog had cut off all the main roads. We were trapped. That's when I remembered something I'd seen near the summit, something that gave me an idea. A crazy, probably suicidal idea, but watching more people die every day, I knew I had to try something, and if I was right about what was controlling these creatures, maybe, just maybe, I could end this. I just had to figure out how to get to the summit alive, and with the fog creatures hunting me personally now. That wasn't going to be easy. I spent that night in my cabin, planning. The fog was thickest near the summit, and I had this gut feeling that's where I'd find answers. But something kept bothering me. Why did I keep seeing Jenny in the fog more than anyone else? Then it hit me. I was sitting there looking at her old hiking photo when everything clicked. The day Jenny died, there had been a strange mist on the mountain. Not as bad as this one, but similar. What if she wasn't just another victim of a regular rock slide? What if these things had been here before, waiting, growing stronger? I pulled out her diary from my desk drawer, the one I couldn't bear to read after she died. The last entry made my hands shake. Dad, there's something weird in the fog today. I keep seeing lights, and I think I hear voices calling me. I'm going to check it out. Don't worry. I'll be careful. My Jenny hadn't just died in an accident. These things had taken her, and somehow they were keeping her spirit trapped in there with them. That night, I heard her voice outside my window. clearer than ever. "Daddy, help me. I'm so cold." It wasn't just a trick anymore. Part of Jenny was really in there, trapped with those creatures. Maybe parts of all their victims were stuck in there, being used as bait for more people. I spent hours checking my old military gear. If extreme cold made these things stronger, maybe extreme heat would hurt them. But the higher you go up Mount Rainier, the colder it gets. I needed another way. Then I remembered something from my mountain rescue training. The weird way wind works around mountain peaks. Strong winds, really strong ones, can actually warm up the air through something called compression heating. The summit of Rainier was famous for its violent winds. I had a plan now, a dangerous, crazy plan, but it was all I had. I would climb to the summit, right into the heart of their territory. If I could somehow use the summit winds against them, maybe I could warm up the fog enough to weaken them. Maybe I could free Jenny and all the others. But as I packed my gear, I knew something else too. Even if I succeeded, I probably wasn't coming back down. The creatures wouldn't let me leave alive. Not after I'd learned so much about them. Looking at Jenny's photo one last time, I realized I was okay with that. If I could save her soul and stop these things from killing more people, it would be worth it. Tomorrow at dawn, I would start climbing, one way or another. This had to end that I started climbing just as the sun came up. The fog was thicker than ever, swirling around me like angry clouds. I could hear them following me, whispers, footsteps, and shapes moving just out of sight. But this time, I didn't run. The climb was the hardest I'd ever done. The cold was so bad it felt like my bones were freezing. My gear kept icing over, and the fog creatures kept trying to trick me into taking wrong turns. They showed me false trails and made sounds of rescue helicopters that weren't really there. Halfway up, they tried their worst trick yet. Jenny appeared right in front of me, looking just like she did that last morning. "Dad, please turn back," she begged. "You'll die up here." It broke my heart, but I knew it wasn't really her. Not completely. The real Jenny would never ask me to give up. Near the summit, the wind was howling like 1,000 angry wolves. The fog was so thick I could barely see my own hands. That's when I found it, the center of everything. It was like a tornado made of fog, spinning slowly, with dark shapes swimming inside it. And in the middle, I saw them, dozens of floating lights, each one a trapped soul. Jenny's was there, glowing bright blue. The creatures attacked all at once. They came at me from every direction, trying to freeze me, trying to pull me apart like they did to the others. The cold was so bad I couldn't feel my legs anymore, but I kept going. I pulled out my last weapon, a flare gun loaded with special phosphorus flares, the kind that burns super hot. The wind was getting stronger, just like I'd hoped. Hot air was starting to rush up from below. "Jenny!" I screamed into the fog tornado. "Fight them! Remember who you are." Her light flickered and started glowing brighter. Then other lights started glowing too, all the trapped souls fighting back. The fog creatures shrieked, a sound like ice cracking. I fired the flare straight into the center of the tornado. The hot phosphorus mixed with the warm wind, creating a blast of heat that shot straight up into the fog. The creatures screamed louder as the fog began to burn away. The last thing I remember is seeing Jenny's light break free, glowing brighter than ever. She floated down to me, and for just a second, I saw her smile, her real smile. "Thanks, Dad," she whispered. Then everything went white. They never found my body. The fog disappeared that day, taking the creatures with it. The official report says I died in an avalanche, but the locals know better. They say on cold mornings, when the fog rolls in, you can sometimes see a figure walking the trails, still keeping watch over the mountain. The park closed that section permanently, but every year, on the anniversary of that day, a strange fog appears briefly on the summit, and sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can hear a father and daughter laughing together in the mist. I don't know if anyone will ever believe this story, but if you're ever hiking in the mountains and see an unusual fog, remember my tale. Not all mists are made of water, and not all stories have happy endings, but sometimes, just sometimes, love is stronger than death, and sometimes the real monsters aren't the ones that look scary. They're the ones that look just like the things we've lost.